Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Robert Steneck, Bob Steneck. He's a professor of marine sciences, University of Maine. He seems to focus a lot on delicious, buttery Maine lobsters, but more in their natural habitat. But Bob, thanks for coming. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, tell me about your research. What does it involve?
Well, I've been doing this for a long time. Got started working on lobsters around 1983, and at the time, lobsters were thought to be in steep decline, and I was seeing different things underwater. I was one of the first people to actually study lobsters in their natural habitat. And we started seeing populations go up, and really from about 1985 to 2016, we almost had a record harvest every year. And since then, we've seen landings decline to some degree, and we've seen other troubling signs like keeping track of the number of baby lobsters on the seafloor, and we started seeing those decline, and we're wondering what's going on. So my research now is looking at some factors that are indirect factors related to climate change. And I could explain it more, but I figured you'd...
Yeah, we'll get into that. So what differences have you noticed in studying lobsters in their natural habitat? Like, how'd you do it? Did you scuba dive down in the ocean and hang out with them for 15, 20 minutes? Or how did you observe them?
Yeah, I mean, really, scuba diving is a major tool used for studying lobsters, and did a lot of experiments. We focused on, where baby lobsters came from, what lobsters eat, who eats them, what kind of habitats they prefer, how does this relate to the lobster fishery. But to get to deeper water, we used small 2- and 4-person submarines and remotely operated vehicles, which are little tethered robots, which we were actually doing this summer also. So it's a challenge, but lobsters are very abundant in Maine. The most abundant lobster in the world is the lobster on the coast of Maine. So a lot of these methods work pretty well, but still there's a lot of questions, and that's really where we're going with all this. How the ecosystem is changing, in some ways positive, some ways negative to lobsters, and what that might mean for the fishing industry.
So what's the role of lobsters in their various niches? What do they do?
Well, it's interesting. There are different ways of thinking about organisms in any ecosystem, and in marine ecosystems, you have these critters you might call ecosystem drivers. If they're abundant, they fundamentally change the ecosystem. But then there are these ecosystem passengers, and that is, as the ecosystem changes, they change. And lobsters are really more ecosystem passengers than they are ecosystem drivers. So the changes that we're seeing, I think, and nobody believes that the changes are the result of the lobster fishery. It's a very interesting fishery in that it may be the only fishery on the planet that's been targeted for 150 years, but is doing better today than ever before. But the question is, how is ecosystem change, whether it's warming sea temperatures, change in predators, ocean acidification, invasive seaweed, oxygen levels, what might be affecting lobster populations in the last several years? That's really what our focus is right now.
Yeah, I just don't know much about lobsters besides eating them. So that's why I asked you, what are some details about them that you learned that are really interesting the public just has no clue about?
Well, most people would be shocked to learn that lobsters live to be 100 years old. The world record lobster is nearly 50 pounds in weight. Yeah, lobsters they're very solitary, and the only time they cohabitate with other lobsters is to mate. Mating goes on after the female sheds her shell, and and at that time she sets out a waterborne hormone that that stops the male lobster's natural aggressive behavior. So he'll mate with her and he won't kill her. And there have been experiments done because the male lobster actually has to sense the female's hormone, and does that with these little smelling antennules, little antenna. And if you disable those antenna, the lobster will actually eat the female that he's trying to mate with. It's pretty nasty. But the bottom line is that the female then has these little packets of sperm. Later, after the male's long gone, she'll extrude the eggs. She fertilizes the eggs with that sperm packet. She carries the eggs for 9 to 11 months, and I think a lot of your viewers might understand what goes on with carrying your offspring for 9 months. And then the eggs will hatch, and they'll be pretty big. Incidentally, it's possible then a couple months later for the lobster to extrude eggs again and actually fertilize them from that same male spermatophores that he received on that mating event that happened 2 years ago. Yeah, it's a really unusual. I don't know another invertebrate capable of doing that, actually.
That's really interesting, because what's the condition of the spermatophores if they're in the female lobster for a month or more? They must be kept alive, and how do they interact with the? Wow, that's amazing.
Over a year. And no, I actually don't know those details, and they're interesting details. And it does, the mating of the lobsters is probably closer to the sort of mating that wolves do, in that there is dominant males, and they are the males that the females sort of quote unquote want to mate with. They'll delay their molting until they can mate with that dominant male. So you could actually have an alpha male really responsible for fertilizing a high percentage of the females in an area, and it may in fact be 2 clutches of eggs over a 2-year period. So that's different, and I think most people don't realize that. But the focus that I've been having has more to do with just how lobsters interact in the seafloor, and how the seafloor and the coastal marine ecosystem in Maine is changing.
Yeah, well, quick question, I guess, again, because I know so little about them. Supposedly, I guess when lobsters were first encountered, they were fed to prisoners, and people thought they really had no value.
Well, there's a lot of stories like that. Some are probably true and some are probably not true. But without a doubt, big lobsters were relatively abundant in relatively shallow water. I mean, relatively big lobsters. The industry began as a cannery. And in the 1800s, they were looking for lobsters that were over 10 pounds each, really 10, 15, maybe a 20-pound lobster would be ideal, because it's very good for the canning industry. By the 1880s, some of the canneries were complaining that they're not finding as many 12-pound lobsters as they used to. And the fact is, almost none of your listeners have probably ever seen or eaten a 10 or 12-pound lobster. Your typical lobster is roughly a pound and a half in size. So it's a really different fishery back then than it is now. And at least some people believe that the reason why you actually had so many big lobsters is because lobsters are very susceptible to predators like cod. But when they get big and they've got big claws, they're relatively safe. And since, as I mentioned, they can live for a long time, you actually had a lot of big, old, nasty claw lobsters that were pretty safe from predators until humans came by.
Would the larger lobsters protect the smaller ones, or at least the mother lobsters? How long do they guard their progeny for? Until what age?
Well, that is interesting. When the female sheds and she's vulnerable and she's got she's just mated, there is some evidence that the males will guard the females, but by and large, the behavior that I've observed more than anything else is the females find a really good shelter where they're pretty safe, and then they don't go out until they harden up. And that might be a week or maybe at least 3 or 4 days. And once they're hardened up, I've handled, at least thousands of lobsters. And females with eggs are by far the most aggressive. And even lobstermen, they go through their trap, they open up a lobster trap, and they reach in. And if a lobster is an egger, they're very careful, because as soon as they start bringing their hand into the trap, that lobster will be attacking the lobsterman. And they're very, very aggressive when they have eggs.
Have you been pinched by a lobster before?
I sure have, plenty of times. And the secret sometimes when I'm doing my surveys, I'd say most of the time you might get one lobster, but sometimes you get two, and occasionally you get three lobsters that you find within a square meter, all in different shelters. And so you grab them all before they can escape. And then you have the problem that you actually have to measure them and write down their size, their sex, a number of different things, but you only have two hands. And so my writing slate is on one wrist, but I'm really lucky if I can hold two lobsters in one hand. And then I have the other lobster, and with that lobster in that other hand, I have to manage my ruler. And the fact of the matter is that, yes, there have been times when I didn't juggle it well, and the lobster won the bout by, muckling onto my thumb.
You know what maybe you should do is, if you can get like Amazon Alexa or something like that, or Google, and, like you say, Alexa, I have a 2-pound lobster, female, blah, 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 and then you wouldn't have to write anything, Just an idea.
You're right. They do make full face masks, full face masks that you can actually talk into, and you could record all the information. I don't do that in part because technology is great, but when it fails, you are really sunk. And when I go down and I've got a lobster and I measure it and I write it down on a slate on my wrist, I know I'm going to have that. But I could imagine, like doing a whole dive and finding out that it didn't record. So anyway, yeah, I hear you. There probably are better ways of doing it, but this is the way I've been doing it for well over 20 years.
Based on the growth rate of lobsters, so if most of the time now people get a 1 pound or 1.5 pound lobster, how old are they? And what is that doing to the lobster populations? Like, how old are they when they mate? And how old are the ones that are being eaten for the most part?
Yeah, those are good questions. And actually it depends on where you are. Further south, where water temperatures are warmer, lobsters reach reproductive maturity at a earlier time. They're reaching the harvestable size at the same size, but they get there sooner, like 5 years, something like that down in Rhode Island. It's more like 7 to maybe 10 years in Maine before they reach harvestable size. Reproductive maturity comes later, except that there are recent studies that have been showing that lobsters are actually reproducing at smaller size now. And it may well be because they do reproduce at smaller size in warmer temperatures, and the ocean is getting warmer. So on the coast of Maine, if you just work in the mid-coast of Maine, as I have since the 1980s, water temperatures warming, and the reproductive lobsters are getting smaller.
But again, how old are they? Like, at what age do they tend to reproduce? We'll just take Maine offshore.
Yeah,
the average age, and then what age do we eat them at?
We eat them at about, let's say, 7 years, and they're reproducing at about 8 to 10 years, age. But lobster traps are very inefficient, and there have been studies that have shown lobsters going in and out of traps. And when I've published several papers on this, it's really kind of interesting, but you expect that you're going to be overfishing the stocks the way you do most things, but the number of traps actually has gone down since 1995, and the catch per trap has been going up steadily. So the population overall, and there's also ways that the state and federal government trawls the coastal waters and offshore waters, and they document the abundance of lobsters, and by and large they've been going up in abundance. So this is a very interesting fishery in that as we keep fishing them, their abundance keeps increasing.
Has anyone done an experiment where a lobster is mated and they produce progeny, and then if there are fewer males around, or if you take the progeny away, let's say after it's a year old, that induces the female to use stored spermatophores to produce more? Could that be a reason why they're increasing instead of decreasing?
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
No, I mean, I don't think anybody's done that. And also, you have to realize that a lobster goes through its period of time. It's carrying its eggs on its tail, on the bottom of its tail. Eggs, it's very obvious when you pick up a lobster that has eggs. When they hatch, that's it. And if the eggs abort, as happens sometimes due to handling or other stresses, there's no obvious change in lobster behavior. The lobster will continue to behave as they always have and go through a normal cycle. And it takes a period of time before new eggs are formed within the lobster. And then she extrudes them. Then she fertilizes them either with a recent or past spermatophore. I think that lobsters have a lot of instincts, but I've never been very impressed with their intellect.
So the lobsters, they don't care if the baby's abort or not, but do they care for the progeny? Do they teach them anything, or they just say have a nice day?
No, they're gone, and it's a good question about exactly how far from a mother lobster do the babies land, but it'll be miles, or it might even be 10s or 50 miles apart. So if one took a very careful genetic study and had just tons of money, they may be able to figure out if there are any offspring that are related in a region where you find a female, if any of her offspring are found in that area. But I would guess that would be a needle in a haystack and would be extraordinarily rare.
Right. So how does a fishery look? How do you make a lobster fishery?
Well, the interesting thing about this is that unlike most fisheries where the concerns are biological, are we fishing too many? They can't reproduce, or we're catching them when too small a size. There are really no biological concerns about lobsters as they reproduce. Almost all the crises in most of the last 20 years have been economic. And by that, I mean, lobster is kind of a luxury food. So when we had the Great Recession, people stopped buying lobsters. More recently, we've had, with the pandemic, cruise ships, which account for 30% of all the lobsters caught in Maine. Cruise ships simply stopped buying lobsters because they were out of operation.
Wow.
Exports to China, very important. It started up over the last decade. China was very interested in working in Maine, and there were local distributors who were gearing up for a very big Chinese market. But unfortunately, when the tariffs were put in place by our government, the Chinese simply decided to do business with Canada. We subsequently removed the tariffs on lobsters, but the Chinese said, no, we're fine. We're just going to work with Canada. So we lost that market. There's also been a fair number of incidents related to our marketing to Europe. Before the COVID outbreak, there was concern about whether lobsters were escaping in Europe, and there was an interest among some Swedish scientists to ban the import of live lobsters. That ended up, the scientific evidence simply wasn't there, so that did not go forward. But Europe, just like the United States, has the same problem where suddenly the COVID outbreak was a serious problem, and people were worried about where they're going to get toilet paper, and they just certainly weren't buying lobsters. So the price per pound for lobstermen at the dock was getting to be something like $2.50. And what we were buying them locally for $4.99, it was actually inexpensive for us to have a lobster dinner. Now, since then, the price of lobsters has gone up a little bit, but still here in Maine, it's $6.99 right now, a pound. That's not bad. Yeah.
I remember in 1987, I went to summer camp in Maine, and we had lobster, and it was like $2 for dinner, and I couldn't believe it, And then, I've lived in New York and other places, and like lobster normally in a restaurant, it's like, $25, $30 now. So
that's right. And
I know it needs to be, but it's a big difference.
That's a global phenomenon. I mean, if you go any place, in the world, and you order lobster, it's expensive. The cheapest lobster on the planet is the Maine lobster. But again, as you just said, if you buy it in Maine, it's actually pretty cheap. As soon as they export it, they charge the the lobster price that restaurants ask, which is really expensive.
Yeah, it makes sense. So you were talking about the ecology and how they kind of ride along with the ecology, but they don't they don't really shepherd it. So what's been happening, to like Maine lobsters, for instance, whatever you observed over the past few years, what's going on?
Well, one of the things that we observed was lobsters like to live in shelters. They're solitary critters. And so for over a decade, my group of students and interns and myself, we would go out and we would measure the distribution, abundance, and body size and habitat use of lobsters. And we did that from 1989 to 1999. And I got a grant to look at it again. And I did those dives last summer, and what we found was lobsters are no longer concentrated in shelters. They are distributed in other places. And the other thing that's interesting is the seafloor is covered with a shag carpet of seaweed, which is not native to North America. And I became worried that some of these changes may be making traditional lobster habitats hostile. And specifically, I'm wondering whether this seaweed, which is growing but also rotting on the seafloor, and warmer temperatures that tend to hold less oxygen, is there an oxygen depletion going on inside traditional lobster shelters? And so this summer, we were diving with oxygen probes and recording oxygen meters. We're doing experiments in the laboratory, looking to see if lobsters will tend to avoid shelters that have low oxygen in them.
What do their shelters look like? I mean, I imagine like a rocky outcropping.
Yep.
Or is there any coral in Maine? I mean, what
no,
shelter?
There's not stony coral the way you might expect to see them in the Florida Keys or in the Caribbean. But if you go to a boulder field, and boulders are stacked on top of themselves, you can find these crevices between the boulders that you could stick your arm into. And typically, lobsters are curious and their eyesight's not very good. So as you're approaching a boulder field, often you'll see the lobster antenna coming out, trying to sense what is coming its way. So right away, you start seeing where the lobsters are. And back in the day, it was, 20 years ago or so, every single shelter would have antenna coming out. That's not the case now, but it's interesting because the lobsters are just sitting on top of ledge and they're sitting on top of sediment. So you can just see the lobsters there, but they're not in the shelters. And the question is, why are we seeing this change in their behavior? Is it due to something like oxygen, or is it simply the fact that there are literally no predators anymore because we've overfished cod and other things that would be eating lobsters? So the lobsters don't, quote, need to be in shelters. We don't know the answer to that yet.
So why would you think that the oxygen level in their shelters has gone down? Is it because are there dead zones in and around the coast of Maine, or what would create this low oxygen level if you're hypothesizing it?
Yeah, you don't typically think of Maine because of its cold water having dead zones, but you don't have to go very far. Like within Cape Cod, down in Massachusetts, Cape Cod Bay, there are areas of depleted oxygen. The trouble is that when you have a lot of organics, whether it's due to fertilizer coming down in estuaries or whether it's due to seaweed that's rotting on the seafloor, there's a certain amount of oxygen used up by microbes, and how much oxygen is in the water depends on how cold the water is. I think all of your listeners probably realize that if you have a carbonated drink and it's in the refrigerator and you open it up, it just does a little fizz. But if you put it on the dashboard of your car and you warm up that liquid and then you open it up, it explodes. And that is the warm liquids just simply can't hold as much dissolved gas, and that holds for oxygen. And we know the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet. There have been reports that it's warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. And with that warming, there are these secondary effects of climate change, such as the possibility that there's lower levels of oxygen, especially at night. Lobsters go out and they forage at night. And then as sun is just coming up, when oxygen levels would be the lowest, that's when they choose their shelters. It's possible that they're not choosing shelters because overnight seaweed been rotting in there.
Mm.
And they just decide, I'm not going there. And they don't need to because there aren't any predators out there to eat them.
Well, how much of an oxygen level difference and a water temperature difference are the ones that you can access by scuba, the shallow ones versus the deep ones?
Right. And that is what we're doing right now. And so far, we've definitely seen variations from day to night. We definitely see lower levels of oxygen in shelters versus outside shelters. But until we've really analyzed all the data, I don't really want to go out on a limb, except to say it is what we're studying right now. It's kind of the cutting edge for my lab in terms of, is this an issue or not? We just don't know yet.
Well, I don't know if you've gone recently to, again, even for 15, 20 minutes or an hour to hang out, under the water with the lobsters. Like, have you done that recently? Are you observing differences in behavior? Like what interesting stuff have you seen by hanging out, underwater near the lobsters?
Yeah, I mean, I've been diving with lobsters within the last 2 weeks, if that's what you mean. The thing is, as I said, lobsters' eyesight's not that great, but their big antenna that everybody would recognize, those are mechanoreceptors, and they can detect vibrations. And as a scuba diver, every time you exhale and you send out bubbles, that's like a hand grenade going off next to a lobster. They hate that. So when I'm approaching a lobster, I can see it in its shelter, and I'm approaching it to catch it, and then I measure its vital signs, and then I put it back in the shelter. But I have to hold my breath. I don't change my water depth. That's a scuba no-no. But I hold my breath so that I don't exhale. If I exhale before I capture the lobster, he will just retreat way deep into the shelter. I'll never get him.
What do you mean a grenade going off? Like, so if there's a bunch of bubbles, what is the lobster sensing? And it just literally runs?
Yeah, the lobster, they look like they've got this hard shell, and they should be impervious to anything. But no, actually, they've got these hairs called sensory setae, and they're quite good at detecting any kind of motion. When I use my remotely operated vehicle, it has little propellers. I can actually get pretty close to the lobster. That doesn't bother it. But when, as a scuba diver, you exhale, that is effectively sends out a shock wave that they pick up, and they always react to it. As a matter of fact, if you've ever done any diving in the tropics, reef fish do the same thing. You have to be careful how you control your breathing. And for a lot of people who study fish and some other organisms, they have rebreathers so that they're not exhaling into the water. I simply have techniques that allow me to do my work under normal scuba rather than having to use a rebreather. But that's, decades and decades of observations of lobsters. And I know that they are very sensitive to human presence on scuba. And the reason why I mention this is that you're asking me, wouldn't it be cool just to watch their behavior? And the only way I've been able to watch their behavior for extended periods of time is with my remotely operated vehicles. I've actually built these hangars where I could fly the remotely operated vehicle into a little device. It would hold them steady, and I could watch them for hours. And I've done that.
Oh, I'm going to ask you about that in a second, but you know how people will smoke bees and kind of calm them down so they can be worked with? What if you set up like a deliberate, slow, steady bubble near the lobster? And maybe at first it runs, but then it gets used to it. And if it's getting this continual, pulse of the bubbles, and it's regular, maybe that would lull it into being desensitized to other stimuli.
Well, that's interesting. Certainly never tried that. My sense is, because I work with a lot of different organisms with different levels of cognitive capacity, I would say. And my sense is that lobsters really, they have entrained instinctive behaviors, but they don't look to have a lot of obvious learned behaviors. And one of the things that I've noticed, for example, is that, and I published a paper on this, but lobsters, they're not only very solitary, living in single shelters, but they don't want any other lobster living near them. So when lobsters are abundant and when they're range, let's say a lobster that's close to harvestable size, the kind you might see on your plate, it can detect any lobster that's roughly within a meter of it. And when I did experiments where I had lobster shelters and I changed the shelter spacing so they got closer and closer, the lobsters were evicting the other lobsters that were within its range of detection. And they would be fighting sometimes all day long. It's really, they only need one shelter, but they would keep fighting with these other lobsters. And one of the things that I observed was these lobsters, after they would have all these competitive bouts, they would then leave this whole arena and they would go to a place where there are just fewer lobsters. And I call that demographic diffusion. It doesn't really matter what the term is, but it means that these lobsters that are capable of winning their bouts are actually choosing to go to areas where population densities are lower just because they don't have to fight all day. And that means that they're not able to just turn off that fighting instinct. They have to leave. So it's an anger management behavior they have.
Well, I guess one thing I realized, and this is just my experience, it's probably the same as other people, but the only time I've really been able to observe lobsters much, like I remember being a kid and going to Red Lobster and they'd have them all in the tank and they'd have rubber bands around some of their claws and,
right.
We're at a Chinese restaurant. But now I see it with different eyes. Like it's sad because probably the lobsters are all really stressed and they hate being there on top of each other. And then, if you want to have a delicious lobster, you probably wouldn't taste very good. They're probably full of stress hormones and all that, and not good to eat.
That's an interesting point, and I don't know if anybody has looked for stress hormones, but you may well be right.
Anything you've observed from like handling really old lobsters versus young ones? Do they seem to learn any behaviors or become more crotchety when they're older, or what have you observed in age?
Well, the biggest thing that's obvious to me, handling really big lobsters, is how slow they are. A smaller lobster can, it can catch you off guard and it could clamp down on you. But these big lobsters, and I'm talking about lobsters that when I'm seeing them underwater and catching them, I can't pick them up with one hand because their carapace, their back is too broad. I have to use two hands. But as I do that, and that lobster, he'll lift, he or she, it's usually a he because they grow a little bit faster at that size. They actually lift up their claws when I pick them up, and their claws might be at about the height of my shoulder, and their tail is down around where my knee is. And those are the really big ones that I picked up. They, I think that they really, I don't want to ascribe fear or anything like that to a lobster because I think they mostly just react on behavior, on instinctual behaviors. But a lobster that size really does not have anything to worry about. The biggest cod that ever lived could not eat a lobster of that size. And so it's only really humans. And also the lobster traps are designed so really big lobsters literally cannot get into a lobster trap. They're not marketable. So at least not in Maine, there's a maximum size above which you can't harvest them. So when I've been out working with lobstermen, on occasions we picked up really big lobsters, but the way we've done is the lobster was on top of the trap, not in the trap.
Oh, okay.
And we pick it up and then we look at it and then we throw the lobster back in the water.
Yeah, I've heard, again, this comes from my, commercial or restaurant experience, but I remember I took my kids to a restaurant a few years ago and they pulled out one of the lobsters so they could touch it. And then the person said, you have to be careful how you put it back in the tank, because if you put it back in suddenly, I guess air bubbles will get trapped in the carapace and it could hurt the lobster or kill it.
Well, you do have to be careful how you handle a lobster. Air bubbles in the carapace is probably not an issue, but if a lobster is roughly handled, they actually have the capacity to excise their claws. It has its own name, autonomy, but and so the lobster actually will throw, and lobstermen say they threw a claw. And that, of course, actually pretty much crashes its market value. So you have to be careful about that. Lobsters that do that in lobster traps are sometimes set aside for either to bring it home to eat it at home, or it can go into a lobster chowder, but it's not likely going to have great value when it's sold as a live lobster.
They just they drop a claw, they pinch it off and lose it?
Yep, absolutely right. And it has happened to me, and I hate it when it happens, but as you can imagine, I'm working underwater, and if I've got a lobster and I'm pulling it out of its shelter, I can actually feel this click. And what and I usually, I almost never will grab the claw. I'm always trying to grab the carapace. But, as I'm pulling it out, the claws are right there. And sometimes I feel that click and I know it's a cull. That's what they call it. A cull is a lobster with either one claw or no claws. And
how could the lobster do? Like, have you looked at it just visually or under the microscope? Like, how does the lobster do that?
Yeah, no, there's a good biology around it. They actually have a way, they have an open circulatory system, but they actually have a way of basically cutting off, all the blood. They don't bleed out when this happens. And there's a plate basically that seals that. It's not that uncommon. And imagine a lobster that is only able to grow when it molts, and it may molt when it's getting close to harvestable size. It's only molting one or maximally two times in a summer. But if they lost their claw, they can produce this little leathery limb bud. And it's a funny little thing. It looks like a claw. It's not functional, but it'll actually get to be an inch or two long. And then the next time they molt, there'll be a somewhat smaller, but not tiny claw. And then the next time they molt, it'll be a full-size claw. And so they can recover from that. They can regenerate their claws. And I guess the evolutionary thinking here is it's always better to lose a claw than lose a life.
Yeah, that's just amazing they can do that. Like, it's weird. Like, what happens to their flesh inside? I guess I haven't looked at it. How does it segment off like that without it, like, bleeding to death? And does it cauterize? Like, what does it do?
Well, it would be closest to being cauterized, but it's not. It has this abscission plate, I think it's called, that seals it off. But the fact is there is meat there, and I've never done it, and I don't think I could legally do it. But you could take that claw home and pop it in boiling water and have a meal out of it. And as you may know, there are some fisheries for crabs, like the Florida mud crab fishery. It's a claw-only fishery. So they catch the crab in traps and they pull the claws off and they throw the crab back in the water. And it's been discussed for lobsters, but it's not a good idea, in part because their mating and their competitive ability and everything is linked to their claw size. And so you really are messing with them in a big way by removing their claws.
Well, if you remove the smaller male one claw of the smaller males, they're probably not going to mate much anyway. I guess it would predispose like the biggest, baddest ones to mate more, but I don't know.
You might be right, but again, the real money in lobsters is selling whole lobsters, and the size that you typically see. And so that's the product that the lobster want to bring into the market.
Yeah, interesting. I think it's so interesting. It's rare to find someone like you, so it's really cool to talk to you about this stuff, and I'm genuinely curious about them.
Yeah, well, it's a curious fishery, and it happens to be the single most valuable species to the fisheries of the United States.
Oh, wow.
You can think about, like Alaska salmon or something, but that's actually multiple species, and no single species of salmon is worth as much as our American lobster.
Have you genetically sequenced lobsters, or have you looked at like their microbiome, or are there animals or other creatures living on or in and around their shells, or fish that hang out with them?
I haven't, but their lobsters have been studied up and down, in part because you could be a biologist in Nebraska and go to a grocery store and get a lobster that you could study. So all these things, physiology of lobsters is pretty well known. I can't say I've read any papers on gene sequencing in lobsters, but I'd kind of be surprised if they haven't done that. There are organisms that are associated with lobsters. I think there was a new organism that was found on the lip of a lobster a couple of years ago, new to science. And so it is kind of a walking micro community, especially because the shells, the bigger they get, the less frequently they molt. So a big lobster, the kind I'm talking about when I need two hands to pick it up, they typically have these big old barnacles on them. They've got stuff growing on their back. It's been 5 years or more since they've shed into a new shell. So yeah, it's a little walking community. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, very good. Well, Bob, what's the best way for people to learn more about your work?
Well, they can certainly just Google, Steneck, Steneck, and you'll see, plenty on Google, and also Google Scholar shows the papers that I've written about lobsters, but also there's a lot written about lobsters. So there's everything from children's books to every detail that you want to know, and it's all sitting there online for all these people who are sheltering in place. There's plenty to read out there.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
You bet. My pleasure. You take care.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.